You think you've heard the worst of Nazi Germany. You've read about Auschwitz. You've seen the images of burning cities, skeletal prisoners, mass graves. You've watched documentaries that attempted to capture the scale of suffering, the madness of Hitler, the cold precision of Himmler. But there is a chapter so dark, so repugnant, that even the SS, the very architects of the Holocaust, looked at it and flinched. This is the story of the WWII Brigade, a unit so vile, so grotesquely violent, that it made monsters uncomfortable. And it all began with one man, Oskar WWII. How does a man like that rise? What kind of world allows him not only to exist but to lead? Oskar WWII wasn't just a sadist. He was a man whose soul had rotted long before war gave him license to unleash his urges. Born in Würzburg, Germany in 1895, WWII was a World War I veteran, wounded multiple times, decorated with the Iron Cross, and yet, even then, he stood apart not as a hero, but as a deeply disturbed individual with a violent streak and a fascination with cruelty. After the war, Germany fell into economic ruin, and in that chaos, the seeds of Nazi ideology found fertile soil. WWII joined right-wing paramilitary groups, the Freikorps, and fought against leftist uprisings across Germany. It wasn't about politics, it was about bloodshed. For WWII, violence was the point. By the 1930s, his depravity had already made headlines. He was arrested and convicted for raping a 14-year-old girl, and lost his job with the government. Any normal state would have buried him in prison. But this wasn't a normal state. This was Nazi Germany, and in a regime built on violence and dehumanization, even men like WWII could be useful if they knew the right people. Enter Gottlob Berger, a high-ranking Nazi and personal friend of Heinrich Himmler. Berger helped WWII gain entrance into the Waffen-SS during World War II. He wasn't just let back in, he was given a command. That's when the real nightmare began. The unit he formed was called the 36th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS, better known as the WWII Brigade, but calling it a unit gives it too much structure, too much dignity. This was not a military force in the traditional sense. It was a collection of murderers, arsonists, rapists, and violent criminals, most of them plucked from prisons and concentration camps. WWII's idea was simple: take society's most violent men and give them power, weapons, and no rules. These weren't soldiers, they were animals in uniform, and their leash had been removed. Their first deployment, the occupied territories of Poland and Belarus. Their orders: crush resistance, no matter the cost. In the name of anti-warfare, WWII's men burned entire villages, tortured civilians, executed children. Women were raped and murdered en masse. Victims were mutilated not for information, not even for revenge, but for sport. The atrocities weren't accidents, that were the mission. Witnesses described scenes of such horror that even hardened SS officers protested. One report described WWII's men throwing children into burning buildings. Another described the use of flamethrowers on civilians locked inside barns. The brutality was so extreme that multiple SS officials attempted to have the unit disbanded. Their requests were denied. Why? Because in the Nazi hierarchy, results mattered more than morality, and the WWII Brigade was effective in the most horrifying way possible. Wherever they went, resistance was crushed. Civilians were terrorized into silence. Fear spread faster than bullets. Himmler himself reportedly said WWII's methods were unsuitable for the German people to know, but he allowed them to continue. Why? Because cruelty was part of the message. Imagine being a villager in Belarus in 1942. You hear the distant thrum of trucks, you see the black uniforms, and you pray it's the regular Wehrmacht, because if it's WWII's men, you know what's coming. You've heard the stories: the children burned alive, the men hung by their own intestines, the women dragged into the forest and never seen again. The soldiers laugh while they kill, they enjoy it. And no one, not the Gestapo, not the SS, not even Berlin, will stop them. And Oskar WWII, he leads them with pride. His face is unremarkable, balding, round, middle-aged, but behind that ordinary appearance is a mind shaped by pain and lust for dominance. He walks among his men, not like a general, but like a predator in a cage of other predators. He drinks with them, tortures with them, celebrates with them. His uniform, adorned with medals, hides a man who lives for others, screams. By 1943, his reputation had spread. Even the SS officers stationed nearby would warn each other, stay away from WWII. Some were sickened, others were afraid. He was a loose cannon in a system already built on madness. But the Nazi leadership didn't just tolerate him, they promoted him. Why? Because in their eyes, WWII was a necessary evil. In occupied territories, where partisans hid among civilians, the Nazis believed only terror would break the population. WWII's men didn't hesitate. They didn't ask questions. They burned, they killed, and they left behind ashes. And the message was clear: resistance equals annihilation. This is the part of the war most history books skip over, the part too horrific to film because it doesn't fit the narrative of clean battles and brave resistance. This is filth. This is chaos in uniform. This is what happens when a regime decides that morality is a weakness. What makes this worse is how effective it was. Villages that once harbored partisans suddenly fell silent. People gave up names just to avoid torture. Entire forests were emptied not by strategy, but by sadism. But the horror hadn't peaked yet. That would come later. Dirlewinger's most infamous operation was still to come: the suppression of the Warsaw Uprising in 1944. There, in the ruins of a dying city, the full scale of his inhumanity would be unleashed. But to understand how a man like this was allowed to exist, to lead, and to be celebrated by his superiors, we have to understand what Nazi ideology really tolerated. It wasn't just about control. It was about dehumanization, about creating monsters and then rewarding them for acting monstrously. And in this world, Oskar Dirlewanger wasn't an aberration. He was a weapon by the time 1944 arrived. That weapon was pointed directly at the heart of Warsaw. But before we get there, we need to understand how deep the rot truly went. Because Dirlewanger didn't act alone. He wasn't a lone wolf. He was part of a pack sanctioned, fed and armed by a regime that wanted to terrorize the world into submission. And so we end this first chapter with one question. If these were the men the Nazis feared, what does that say about the Nazis themselves? Subscribe if you haven't already, because in the next chapter we follow Dirlewanger into the ruins of Warsaw, where cruelty reached new heights, and even the SS began to whisper, he's gone too far. When we talk about the Warsaw Uprising of 1944, we often focus on the bravery of the Polish resistance. Teenagers with pistols, engineers turned bomb makers, civilians risking their lives to feed insurgents. It was a desperate bid for freedom, a cry against decades of occupation and terror. But what most people don't know is that when the Nazis decided to crush the uprising, they didn't send their most disciplined troops. They sent monsters. They sent the Dirlewanger Brigade. Warsaw, August 1944. The city is burning. The Polish Home Army has launched an insurrection against the Nazi occupiers. It's chaos. Streets are filled with barricades, sniper fire echoes through alleyways, and every basement hides a family or a fighter. The Germans are losing ground. Hitler is furious. Himmler sees an opportunity not just to win, but to make an example, so he calls in Dirlewanger, and with him comes death. Dirlewanger's men arrive like a storm. These aren't trained soldiers. They're criminals in uniform, and the rules don't apply to them. Their orders suppress the uprising. No limits. What happens next is so horrific, so inhuman, that even SS generals write reports begging for it to stop. The Dirlewanger Brigade targets the Wola district first, a working-class neighborhood home to tens of thousands. No one is spared. Over just a few days, Dirlewanger's men execute more than 40,000 civilians, men, women, children, in factories, in homes, in hospitals. Nurses are raped before being shot. Patients are burned alive in their beds. Infants are thrown out of windows. This is not war. This is massacre. Survivors later recalled hearing laughter as soldiers set buildings ablaze. They remembered the stench of burning flesh, the screams of families locked inside their own homes. There are accounts of Dirlewanger personally overseeing executions, cigarette in hand, expression blank, and still Berlin said nothing. Wola wasn't an isolated event, it was policy. Terror as a weapon. Dirlewanger had the full backing of Himmler, who once wrote, "The Polish people must be exterminated." Dirlewanger was his tool to do it. But the sheer scale of the horror caused friction even inside the Nazi machine. SS officers on the ground began sending coded messages back to Berlin. One called Dirlewanger's behavior barbaric and damaging to discipline. Another warned that his men were out of control and that their presence undermines the moral structure of the SS. But that was the irony. There was no moral structure, only the illusion of it. And Dirlewanger's chaos simply exposed what lay beneath. Back in Warsaw, the Polish resistance was fighting for its life. They didn't have tanks, they didn't have air support, they had Molotov cocktails, stolen rifles, and raw determination. Against them, flamethrowers, machine guns, and men who enjoyed killing for sport. Still they held week after week, street by street. They resisted, and the more they resisted, the more Dirlewanger escalated. His brigade turned entire city blocks into abattoirs. In the Ochota district, survivors were lined up and shot one by one. A hospital was raided, and the wounded were killed where they lay. The walls were covered in blood. The staff were either executed or violated. There's a story documented and verified of a group of priests found praying in a church. Dirlewanger's men ordered them to finish their prayers, and then they were shot mid-amen on, and still, it wasn't enough. Dirlewanger wanted more. He was drunk constantly, often leading operations in a stupor, laughing while torching homes. He reportedly once said, "I've never seen a city burn so beautifully." That was his joy. Not victory, not strategy, but fire, pain, collapse. His brigade grew bolder. They began hunting civilians as if on safari, betting who could kill the most in an hour. There were stories of men using piano wire as garrotes, of children being made to watch the deaths of their parents. And yet, no one intervened. No one removed him from command. Why? Because Warsaw was meant to be a race to Himmler. It wasn't just about defeating resistance, it was about annihilating identity. The city itself, its culture, its people, its memory was to be reduced to rubble, and for that, there was no better tool than Dirlewanger. But even among monsters, there are limits. By late August, some Wehrmacht officers refused to work with the 36th SS Division. One commander ordered his men to avoid contact, stating they'd bring dishonor to the German uniform. Doctors who treated wounded civilians began smuggling out testimonies. One nurse wrote, "I thought I had seen the depths of man's cruelty. I was wrong." The Red Cross tried to intervene, sending desperate requests to Berlin. Neutral diplomats sent warnings. Even the Vatican attempted to raise alarm, but Himmler silenced it all. He needed Warsaw destroyed, and Dirlewanger was delivering, yet cracks were forming. Within Dirlewanger's own unit, tensions grew. Some men, drunk on power and alcohol, began fighting each other. Rape, even within their own ranks, became common. One soldier, according to later court documents, killed his commanding officer in a fit of rage. Another blew himself up trying to light a civilian building on fire. The unit was rotting from the inside, but Oskar Dirlewanger didn't care. He was already a ghost. His only goal was destruction, and in Warsaw he found paradise. By September, the uprising was dying. The Polish resistance was outgunned, outnumbered, and bleeding. Entire neighborhoods were flattened, and through it, all Dirlewanger's men remained, like carrion birds pecking at what was left. When the city finally fell, over 200,000 civilians were dead, the bulk of that number, victims of the Dirlewanger Brigade. No military targets, no strategic objectives, just people. Erased. And here's the horror that lingers. Dirlewanger was not punished, in fact. He was praised. Himmler awarded him the Knight's Cross, one of Nazi Germany's highest honors. He was congratulated for bravery and effective suppression. There was no trial, no court, just medals, promotions, and more missions. You might ask, how could that happen? Because to the Nazi state, men like Dirlewanger weren't aberrations. They were inevitability. The system didn't just permit them, it required them. But history has a way of catching up, and in the next chapter, we'll follow Dirlewanger into the dying days of the Reich, because even monsters have enemies. And in the ashes of war, justice, though delayed, came hunting. Don't miss it, because the end of Dirlewanger is as grotesque as his rise. By early 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing. The Eastern Front was a bloodbath, with Soviet tanks rolling westward like a tide of vengeance. Cities fell one after another. Hitler was holed up in his bunker. Berlin was a few months from becoming a graveyard. But even in these dying days, as the Nazi Empire crumbled, Oskar Dirlewanger was still fighting and still killing. This time it was in Slovakia and Hungary. His mission: suppress partisans, secure supply lines, and cleanse territories of resistance. But as always, Dirlewanger interpreted orders through his own twisted lens. Wherever he went, fire followed. Villages were razed, civilians executed en masse. The logic was simple: if they breathe, they might resist. Dirlewanger's unit, now bloated with fresh recruits from prisons and camps, was barely even functional. Discipline was non-existent. Ammunition was often wasted in drunken brawls between soldiers. Supply lines broke because his men preferred to loot and drink than guard convoys. But none of it stopped Dirlewanger. He still commanded with a terrifying presence, half-mad, half-worshipped, fully deadly. He had become more myth than man to those around him. Some feared him like a god of death. Others mocked him behind his back, calling him the mad dog. But no one dared challenge him face to face. Not in a unit where insubordination could be punished with a bullet to the back of the head, or worse, being thrown to your own comrades. By now, even hardened Nazi officials were pleading for Dirlewanger's removal. Reports of insubordination, war crimes, and total chaos filled Himmler's desk. But Himmler, trapped in his own paranoia and desperation, continued to defend Dirlewanger. He still believed the unit had value, not for its military prowess but for its brutality. The 36th Division became infamous among Germans themselves. Civilians fled when they saw the black insignia. Wehrmacht officers requested transfers just to avoid sharing a front with them. In Hungary, a commander from another SS division was quoted saying, "They are not soldiers, they are animals with uniforms." Dirlewanger, for his part, seemed to embrace the label. His drinking worsened. He would often appear at briefings, drunk, blood on his coat, shaking from withdrawal. Sometimes he wouldn't speak at all, just stare. When he did talk, it was often about cleansing the land or punishing traitors. His language, once coded, was now unhinged. And yet, he kept being deployed. One of the last atrocities committed by his unit happened in the small village of Ludrova, Slovakia, a quiet place until Dirlewanger's men arrived. In one night, they executed 200 people, including pregnant women and children. Houses were burned, the church was destroyed, survivors were forced to dig their own graves. And again, no strategic value, no military reason, just murder. One SS report, buried in archives for decades, described the aftermath. The unit left no survivors, livestock slaughtered, buildings looted, bodies mutilated, no clear command structure present. Dirlewanger didn't care. He didn't operate on strategy. He operated on instinct, cruel, bloody instinct. But history was closing in. In April 1945, the Soviets launched a massive offensive through Hungary and into Austria. Nazi lines crumbled, and for the first time Dirlewanger's invincibility began to crack. His brigade, what remained of it, was torn apart. Many were killed in ambushes, others simply deserted. Some turned on each other. Dirlewanger himself was wounded, shot in the chest by partisans. He was evacuated to Germany for treatment, temporarily relieved of command. But the war had no time left. The end was here. On May 7, 1945, Germany surrendered, and with it, Oskar Dirlewanger vanished. At first, there were rumors. Some said he died in battle. Others claimed he committed suicide. A few believed he escaped to South America, like so many other Nazis, but none of it was true. The truth is far darker. Dirlewanger had fled to the small German town of Altshausen. He assumed a fake identity, Wilhelm Schmidt, and tried to blend in among the sea of fleeing soldiers, wounded men, and frightened civilians. But justice has a long memory. French forces, occupying the region, began interrogating local Nazis. One informant recognized Dirlewanger, despite the beard, the fake papers, the quiet demeanor. He was arrested and brought to a French-controlled prison. There, in a cold cell, guarded by Polish soldiers working with the French, Oskar Dirlewanger met his end. The official report says he died of natural causes, heart failure, but few believe that. What's more likely, that the Polish guards, many of whom had lost family during the Warsaw Uprising, delivered their own form of justice. They beat him to death in his cell, using fists, boots, and rifle butts. No trial, no witnesses. Just revenge, and maybe that's fitting. Because what courtroom could ever measure the weight of his crimes? What sentence could balance the scales? Oskar Dirlewanger died in the dark, alone, unmourned. His grave is unmarked. His legacy is a stain that even the SS tried to forget. And yet we must remember, because Dirlewanger wasn't a lone monster, was a reflection of what happens when cruelty is rewarded, when systems of power shelter evil, when ideology overrides humanity. He was a product of the very system that built him, promoted him, protected him. And if we don't remember, we risk repeating, so let this serve as a warning. There are men, in every generation, who crave violence, who feed on suffering, who dream of power through fear. The question is, will we let them rise? Or will we remember Dirlewanger, a man so vile, so twisted, that even the monsters around him said, "That's too far"? The memory of Dirlewanger forces us to ask deeper questions about how power operates, and how isolated institutions can become complicit in evil. His story isn't just about the past, it's about the kind of world we allow to exist today. When brutality becomes normalized, when accountability vanishes, when cruelty is cloaked in ideology, monsters thrive. History isn't distant. It's a mirror, and as we look into it, we must ask, what would I have done? Would I have spoken out? Would I have resisted? Or would I too have stayed silent? Dirlewanger may be dead, but his legacy survives in the warnings left behind, in the photos that were too graphic to publish, in the testimonies that courts barely acknowledged, in the archives filled with names that no longer have graves. We remember him not to glorify, but to guard against the return of men who build their power on the backs of the vulnerable, to guard against the institutions that quietly allow it to, guard against the silence that makes it all possible. Because once, in a world not so different from ours, a man like Oskar Dirlewanger didn't just exist, he was given a uniform, a command, and a mission, and the world looked away, not again. It's easy to look at Oskar Dirlewanger and say, he was insane, he was a monster, and in many ways, that's true. But stopping there is too comfortable, too safe. Because the real horror isn't just what Dirlewanger did, it's how many people allowed it, enabled it, covered for it, rewarded it. If we want to understand the full weight of what happened, we have to go deeper. We have to look at the system that built him, so let's rewind. Dirlewanger wasn't born a monster. He was born in Würzburg, Germany in 1895, into a middle-class family. He went to school. He had ambitions. He wasn't a warlord or a cult leader. He was a boy with books and dreams. But something shifted when the First World War came. Like many young Germans, Dirlewanger volunteered. He was eager, idealistic, nationalistic, and on the battlefield, he proved fearless, decorated with the Iron Cross, twice wounded, twice promoted. But the war didn't just break nations, it broke souls. And Dirlewanger's soul was never the same. When he returned, the world was different. Germany had lost, the empire was gone, and Dirlewanger, like many others, felt betrayed by the Treaty of Versailles, by the new democracy, by the lack of direction. He drifted. He joined Freikorps militias, brutal paramilitary groups made up of disillusioned soldiers. Their goal, crush communists, reclaim honor, spill blood. It was here, not on a battlefield, that the true Dirlewanger began to emerge. He found comfort in violence, not just as a tactic but as an identity. In 1921, he was arrested for assault. In 1923, again and again. Each time, the charges got darker. By the late 1930s, he had been convicted of sexually abusing a 14-year-old girl, a crime that even in Nazi Germany carried disgrace. But here's where the story should have ended. Prison, exile, obscurity at DIDN, single quotes to DIRLEWANGER. had powerful friends. One of them was Gottlob Berger, a high-ranking SS officer and personal ally of Heinrich Himmler. Berger pulled strings. Files vanished, punishments softened. And when the war began in 1939, Berger had an idea. What if Dirlewanger could be useful? Again, the SS needed men for dirty work that normal soldiers wouldn't do: executions, reprisals, anti-partisan operations. And Berger believed that Dirlewanger, with his brutality, his lack of conscience and his loyalty, was perfect. So they gave him a unit, not just any unit, penal battalion, made up of convicts, poachers, sadists, men with nothing to lose, men who could kill without question. Dirlewanger wasn't just leading monsters, he was building them. And this was the SS's plan. They knew what they were doing. They designed the Dirlewanger Brigade not as a military force but as a weapon of terror on Belarus. Dirlewanger's men weren't given maps, they were given lists. Lists of villages to clear, lists of names to erase. They weren't given tactics, they were given fire and rope. And the SS watched. They documented, they praised. Himmler himself congratulated Dirlewanger on his effectiveness. So when we call Dirlewanger a monster, we must remember he wasn't operating alone. He was backed, supported, and protected by a bureaucracy of horror. But why? Why did the Nazi regime keep Dirlewanger in place? Despite constant complaints from Wehrmacht officers, civilians, even other SS men. The answer lies in fear. The Nazi system, by 1942, was starting to feel pressure. The Eastern Front was brutal, resistance was growing, and the more the regime felt its grip slipping, the more it leaned on terror. They needed someone who would not hesitate, someone who didn't ask questions, someone who would burn a village to the ground and sleep. Like a baby, Dirlewanger was their answer. Even when generals pleaded this man as a liability, they were ignored because the brutality wasn't a flaw. It was the point, and yet, within the SS there were cracks. Some officers, disgusted by what they saw, began compiling evidence, secret memos, photos, witness accounts. There are records of meetings where Dirlewanger's name was spoken with disdain, with fear, even with disgust. One SS doctor reportedly wrote, "He is unfit for command. His crimes are not military, they are pathological." But none of that mattered. Not yet, because Dirlewanger had one thing most others didn't: results when tasked with crushing uprisings. He succeeded through blood and terror. When ordered to secure territory, he did so by depopulating it. His methods were savage, but effective. And in a regime that worshipped control, that was enough until it wasn't. As 1944 turned to 1945, the tide shifted. The Allies were closing in. The Red Army was unstoppable. And suddenly, the brutality that had once been an asset became an embarrassment. The SS began distancing itself. Dirlewanger was no longer celebrated. He was tolerated. But by then, it was too late. The monster had been loosed for too long. His crimes were too vast, his hands too bloody. And in those final months, as his brigade disintegrated, as cities fell, as the Reich began to implode, Dirlewanger didn't change, he didn't retreat. He escalated. In Hungary and Slovakia. In Poland, his unit committed atrocities that even hardened veterans refused to speak of. Villages without names, mass graves without markers. And even then he was not stopped by his own. It took the enemy to finally end him. Captured, beaten, disposed of, no trial, no justice, just silence. And what happened to his unit? Some were executed, some were imprisoned. Many vanished, absorbed into the chaos of post-war Europe. A few were quietly recruited by other regimes experts in terror. After all, are always in demand. The records were incomplete. On purpose, the SS tried to bury the Dirlewanger name. Internal documents were destroyed, witnesses discouraged, testimonies sealed. For decades, the full extent of the atrocities remained hidden behind bureaucracy and shame. It wasn't until the 1960s and 70s that historians began piecing it together through scattered archives, survivor accounts, and faded photographs. What they found wasn't just disturbing, it was chilling. Because the story of Dirlewanger is not just about one man, it's about how systems protect evil, how ideology blinds judgment, how fear silences conscience, how violence, once unleashed, cannot always be recalled. And here's the hardest truth: Dirlewanger could happen again. Not the same man, not the same uniform, but the same dynamics. A violent man, a willing system, a fearful populace, a lack of accountability. Those ingredients exist everywhere, and that's why we tell this story, not for shock, not for spectacle, but as a warning when cruelty is no longer punished, when truth is no longer valued, when power is worshipped, no matter how it is used. Then we open the door to monsters, and they don't always look like Dirlewanger. Sometimes they smile, sometimes they promise safety, sometimes they wear suits, not uniforms. But the result is always the same: pain, loss, silence. We must be vigilant, we must speak, we must remember, because somewhere, right now, someone is watching this story not in horror, but in admiration. And that's the scariest part of all. Dirlewanger is dead, his brigade dissolved, the war ended. So why tell this story now? Because history has a strange way of repeating itself, not in identical form, but in rhythm, in patterns, in echoes. And the echo of Oscar Dirlewanger is not just historical, it's psychological, it's political, it's deeply human. It forces us to confront something most people avoid, the reality that human beings given enough justification, fear and power are capable of monstrous things. But before we reflect, we need to face one last truth, the aftermath. What happened after Dirlewanger died was not a reckoning, it was a silence. His name was removed from official rosters. His unit's files were redacted, locked away, or destroyed. Survivors who tried to testify found no courtroom willing to hear them. Governments on both sides of the Iron Curtain had other priorities: reconstruction, revenge, survival. There was no Nuremberg for Dirlewanger's men, no long trials, no truth. Commissions. The world wanted to move on. And in that silence, something dangerous grew on amnesia in the 1950s and 60s. As Germany rebuilt, many former Nazis reintegrated into society. Some became politicians. Some worked in security forces. Others became teachers, doctors, business owners. Many lied about their pasts. A few even bragged, quietly, to those who listened. The name Dirlewanger was almost forgotten. But evil doesn't stay buried forever. In the 1980s, a few brave historians began digging. In archives, in personal letters, in dusty military records, they found the footprints of the 36th Waffen Grenadier Division. At first, no one believed them. The details were too brutal, the crimes too grotesque. Surely this was exaggeration. But then came the photos, then the eyewitness accounts, then the patterns. Across villages, hundreds of them, and suddenly the story became undeniable. Dirlewanger was real, his crimes were real, and the silence had lasted too long. So, what do we do with this? How do we process a figure so soaked in blood that even the SS flinched? We start by accepting that history is not a fairy tale. It's not a battle of good versus evil with clear winners and villains. It's a web of choices, pressures, incentives, fears, and lies. And within that web, people like Dirlewanger rise not because they are smart, but because they are useful. That's the lesson. Tyranny doesn't need brilliance, it needs obedience and brutality, and the ability to look at another human being and see nothing, no soul, no value, no future. Dirlewanger had that, but he wasn't alone. His brigade followed him, his superiors protected him, his nation looked away. Which brings us to today. In a world where strong men rise again, where propaganda flows faster than truth, where order is valued over justice, where entire groups are dehumanized in political speeches, we must ask ourselves, what are we allowing? What systems are we tolerating? What silence are we justifying? History doesn't scream, it whispers. And right now, that whisper says, pay attention, because the next Dirlewanger won't wear a Nazi uniform. He might wear a suit, he might run a company, he might smile for the cameras, he might speak in polished phrases about security, purity, or cleansing. But the core is the same. Dehumanization, control, violence, and in a system willing to reward those things, evil becomes invisible. That's the horror of Dirlewanger's story. Not just what he did, but how long he was allowed to do it. How many people knew and did nothing. How many survivors lived with the trauma and saw no justice. How many historians fought to tell the truth and were ignored for decades. That's why we tell this story. To honor the nameless, the villagers who disappeared in smoke, the children buried in unmarked graves, the soldiers who tried to speak out and were silenced, the survivors who carried the weight alone. We tell it so that their pain is not erased, so that their voices, though faint, can echo louder than Dirlewanger's cruelty. And we tell it because in a world addicted to simple answers, this is a complex one. It forces us to admit uncomfortable truths, that evil doesn't always wear horns. Sometimes it wears medals. Sometimes it gets promoted. Sometimes it's rewarded for doing the things others are too ashamed to admit they want done. Dirlewanger wasn't an accident. He was a strategy, a mirror held up to a regime that worshipped obedience more than ethics. And when the mirror even the SS turned away, it was already too late. But it doesn't have to be too late for us, because the fight for truth is never over. It lives in the pages of dusty books and in testimonies of the nearly forgotten. It thrives in the voice of a teacher telling a story few dare repeat. It exists in videos like this, where darkness is dragged into the light. And you're watching right now, you are part of that fight. Your memory matters, your curiosity matters. Your refusal to look away matters, because silence is what let Dirlewanger thrive, and noise is what finally stopped him. So let's be the noise. Let's ask questions when others stay quiet. Let's push back when cruelty hides behind uniforms or authority. Let's teach our children not just the names of the heroes, but the names of the monsters, too. Because both lived, both mattered, both left scars. The difference is what we choose to remember. So as the screen fades to black, as the credits roll, remember this: history is not behind us, it's around us. It's written not just in books, but in laws, in speeches, in silence, in the names we honor and the ones we erase. And somewhere, in a dusty file, behind locked cabinets, there are still names like Dirlewanger, still unanswered crimes, Still ghosts waiting to be acknowledged. Let us bring them to light. Let us speak their names. Let us never confuse silence for peace, because the next Durwanger is always waiting, and the only thing standing in his way is us.